The purpose of this video is to give a straightforward and plain English explanation of the essay Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels. This essay is largely a misunderstood document by people who've never read it. Immediately people assume Engels was saying that socialism is utopian and scientific, thereby supposedly discrediting him, and thus by extension Marx, in social theory. But no Marxist ever claimed that their worldview was utopian. Only market fundamentalists do that. In actuality, the document explains the difference between socialism as utopian and socialism that is scientific. There are several views of socialism that were discussed in the Communist Manifesto, utopian and scientific included. The point of this document was to explain why scientific socialism is a better choice and why utopian socialism is wrong. With that said, what I'm going to give is a rough outline to what is written in the document. This will hopefully give you a basic cover of what the document is about. After watching this video, I suggest you read the document for yourself so that you may receive the full context and the full knowledge contained within the work. Again, this is only a brief overview, not a substitute for actually reading and understanding the document. It is only intended to give you a jump start into reading it. Modern socialism, that of 1880, is the result of two elements: its class antagonisms of society, capitalist and worker, and the chaos that is commodity production. The theoretical form of modern socialism comes from updating the theoretical work of French philosophers of the 18th century. As this socialism was new, it had to flow from the already accepted intellectual thoughts on it, even though it came from economic reality. The theorists who began the social thought were true extreme radicals. They were not influenced by any prevailing ideologies. These men nitpicked every detail. Nothing was allowed to exist in their ideology unless it had been examined extensively. When they created their ideology, nothing was based on absolute reason. This was the radical break in social thought. Nothing from the pre-existing societies was preserved. No traditional ideas existed. None of the prejudices. The new idea of socialism was based entirely on eternal right and truth, based on nature and the inalienable rights of men. Unfortunately, this idealized version of society was nothing more than the building of bourgeois society. The equality got reduced to bourgeois property. This ownership of property became the inalienable right of man. This was the creation of the Rousseau social contract, otherwise known as the democratic bourgeois republic. The antagonisms of feudal society gave birth to the creation of the new society. The bourgeois rose up and declared themselves the representatives of everyone. The capitalists realized that they need power over the workers, as the feudal class needed power over the peasants. The difference is, the new ruling class of capitalists could claim to represent everybody. The landlords never even bothered to try. There were theoretical ideas that came about as a result of various class uprisings in 16th and the 7th centuries, but these were utopian. It's just pictures of a perfect way of life and society. They were unattainable goals with no theory of how to reach them. From this came three great utopian socialists. Saint Simon, he united the middle class and the proletarian to a degree. Fournier and Owen, in the most developed capitalist countries, they made proposals for removing classes based on French materialism. Not one of them represented the proletariat. They claimed to want to liberate everyone, but their philosophies represented only the elite. They acted in the name of reason and justice, but were far from the French philosophers they claimed to be inspired by. These three men only created the basis of an unjust, irrational bourgeois system that we have now. The French philosophers, the forerunners of the revolution, did all they could to live by reason, to promote a rational government and society. However, this reason was just an idealized version of the 18th century citizen that had turned into how the bourgeois see themselves. This new rationality only seemed rational when it was compared to the previous feudal society. The new society was built upon Rousseau's social contract, which was unable to hold on to bourgeois property. Thus, the bourgeoisie had to resort to the reign of terror and the Napoleonic despotism in order to hold on to it. The new society of reason did not eliminate class divisions and create a more powerful one. It only altered the existing class relations. It created a freedom of property that created the illusion that anyone can own property. Legally, anyone could. Thus it transferred power from the landlord class to the bourgeoisie class. The bourgeois rule changed the social relations as well. Instead of a knight removing a portion of the crops from the peasant, a person was handed a cash payment for labor. The fraternity of the new society became trade and competition. Oppression was replaced by corruption. From the sword to gold as a social lever, prostitution also increased astronomically. The difficulty lied in the new social relations of production. The drive for socialism was based on the social relations of feudalism. At this time, capitalism was building, but the completeness of capitalism hadn't shown itself yet, meaning that the class relations and how they were going to take shape in capitalism hadn't formed yet. The new form of exchange altered the relations between people economically and did not fit into the view of utopian socialism at that time. Crude, underdeveloped conditions of capitalism and underdeveloped class relations led to underdeveloped ideas about socialism. Not all the conditions of capitalism had revealed themselves because capitalism was still under development. So the great thinkers of socialism at the time attempted to guess what they were going to be and to base their theories on those guesses. A series of ideas what socialism was were created because no one had analyzed the full material reality of what was modern life. All these models were based on very abstract ideas, not based on real material conditions. The more the philosophers worked on a model of socialism that was not based on real conditions, the more it drifted into fantasies about socialist life. They were completely utopian because they were completely abstract ideas, not created from an analysis of really existing conditions. Obviously, this is the fatal flaw in utopian ideas. Saint Simon had a great deal to do with the French Revolution. This revolution was one of the third estate, the people. It was the working people over the idle rich people. But the victory of the people ended up being a victory of the bourgeoisie. The properties of the royal and the church got put up for sale, mostly by fraud through military contracts. My, how things have changed. It was the rule of these swindlers that almost destroyed France, the near ruin that gave Napoleon the pretext for his coup d'etat. Eventually, people began to recognize that the French Revolution was a class war of three classes, a dynamic class war of nobility versus bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. It was also at this time that people first began to get the idea that economics dominates political institutions. They were not totally on top of this idea, but the breakthrough was just beginning to be understood. At this time, and a little after the French philosophy in the 18th century, the new German philosophy, dialectics, appeared. The then modern formation of the dialectic was a combination of dialectics from the past Greek philosophers. However, then new thinkers of it had stuck with it a metaphysical mode of reasoning which gave it a very inflexible character. This, however, did not stop 18th century French philosophers from making their works on dialectics. When we think about nature in general, the history of mankind and our own intellectual activity, it all seems as though it is a mess of random occurrences and relationships that affect other relationships. Everything changes, things come into being, and then pass away. As Engels said, we see, therefore, at first the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and are connected. This just shows the overall picture, the whole scheme of things at once, and does not allow us to see the details that make up the picture. Because it does not allow us to see all the details, we can't get the entire picture. In a metaphysical view, all things and their mental reflexes are isolated things that are analyzed singularly and apart from each other. They see something once, define it, and place it back into the picture with no more thought given to it. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another, and cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis to each other. This is all well and good back in the day. It seemed like it was based on common sense and therefore was completely logical. However, it has its limits, barriers of understanding that it cannot overcome because of its inability to investigate. Because of this, metaphysics became one-sided, restricted, abstract and hopelessly lost in contradiction because it cannot make out the connection between things. It ignores the beginning of things and the end of things. It ignores their motion. This is the fundamental logic of capitalism, but more rigidly held by market fundamentalists. This is how they see the world. They take a supply and demand curve blog post and arrogantly demand that it is reality. They see labor as being nothing more than another commodity in the same supply and demand. Because of this, they fail to see that labor is not like every other commodity. Labor is human beings in motion that don't act like chess pieces. This goes a long way to explaining why their society and their economic structure doesn't work, has never worked, and will never work. With an inability to see how forces interact with each other or how people interact with each other, the only possible explanation of which must be the government. It's always somebody else's fault for their apparent lack of understanding. Metaphysics says a person is alive or not. In reality, it's not that simple. No one knows when a fetus becomes a human being, or even when a collection of cells becomes a fetus. Because the creation of a human being is a process, not an instantaneous event. Death is no different. At what point exactly is a person dead is unknown. An organized being is both itself and not itself. We consume food and water, adding matter to our bodies. Then we expel waste, removing matter from it. During this time, cells die off and new ones are created in a gigantic, complicated process that is human life. Every organized being is always itself, and yet something other than itself. Another aspect that formal logic, metaphysics, can't come to terms with is the unity of opposites. Metaphysics say opposites are in conflict and they work against each other. However, simple scientific analysis shows us that this is not necessarily the case. You have to have a positive and a negative for a magnet to work. You can't have life without death. You can't die unless you've lived. And you can't live if there is only death. The opposites work with each other, not against each other. This also applies to cause and effect. A cause happened that creates an effect. That is simple and straightforward that even kindergartners can understand. However, formal logic stops there, where dialectics continues on. These effects that just took place become the causes that create other effects. The universe and everything in it is one big entanglement of causes and effects. Metaphysics only sees one cause and effect moment and not their effects on the whole of the other causes and effects. Only dialectics understands these things, not metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics understand processes that include the unity of opposites and the fact that things come into being and then leave. Metaphysics is a completely rigid system that cannot understand these things. In fact, only dialectics can explain evolution. Darwin laid down that evolution is a process that takes time to develop. However, there appears to be jumps in evolution from one stage to another. At what point does Homo erectus become Homo sapien? When is the official change made? Evolution is a process that takes place under the immediate surface of physical appearance. The next stage seemingly appearing out of nowhere all of a sudden. Okay, a common creationist attack against evolution is the holes argument. Take any two juxtaposed points on the evolutionary chart and there's a space between those 2 points. Creationists will say there is a gap there, you don't know what happened. In time, a new fossil is found that fills that space, giving an explanation. Then the creationists will say, you haven't explained anything. Now, there are 2 holes on each side of the new fossil. In other words, using metaphysics, you can never satisfy the holes argument, as dialectics understands that it is not an instantaneous change, but a process that takes place under the surface. This new German philosophy finally built up into its modern form, the Hegelian system, as Engels said. In this system and herein is its great merit. For the first time, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, i.e. in constant motion. Change, transformation, development, and the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of this whole movement and development. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. This system also had its problems. Its problem was in the immaterial. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts in his brain were not more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes. To him, they were external ideas that existed before ideas did. He sees ideas as something eternal to the human mind. This mode of thinking is similar to that of religion. It all lies on big contradiction. The Hegelian system says that human history is a process of evolution, which means there cannot be an absolute truth. But at the same time, it claims to be the very essence of absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge embracing everything and the final for all time is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectic reasoning. This perception of fundamental contradiction by necessity led back to materialism. But it did not lead back to the 18th century metaphysical materialism. The old materialism saw human history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees it as an evolution of humanity that leads towards an explanation of it. This means modern materialism is dialectic. It takes in natural science, which has its own history and time. It takes into account celestial bodies, like organic life, under favorable conditions, and are created and then destroyed. It understands these things because materialism and the dialectic work in a synergistic manner. This new conception of nature as a process, not cycles, could only come about through information discovered by research. Social theory is no different in this regard. The class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie became the main event in history in proportion to the development of modern industry and the political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. With the dialectic, we were able to see that all of history, except in the primitive stages, was a history of class struggles. The classes that go to war in any given time are the product of the modes of production and exchange. When this happened, socialism went from being the idea of some genius to becoming the necessary result of a battle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Socialism was no longer idealistic. Its goal was to no longer create a perfect system. It was materialistic, to examine a historical economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonisms had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. The early idealistic socialism could criticize the prevalent mode of capitalist production and its consequences, but it could not understand them and thus could not defeat them or understand how they developed. What this dialectic analysis discovered was the great contradiction in capitalist society that explained not only exploitation, but its eventual downfall, surplus value, in previous times, unpaid labor. These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing to do was to work out all of its details and relations. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes. From this point of view, we can see that revolutions are caused by, not created by, ideas in people's head, but by necessary changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are not found in philosophy, but in the economics of any given time. The bourgeois created the mode of capitalist production. This destroyed the feudal system of production because it was incompatible with a system of free competition. This allowed an explosion in the development of the production of machinery for production. But now machinery has developed to its limits within capitalism, just as it had in feudalism. This limitation is a conflict between the mode of production and the productive forces. This is not a made-up conflict. It exists independent of people's opinion. Socialism is the necessary reordering of society to unlock more productive forces. Before capitalist production, society was a collection of small producers working for themselves. Private property was instruments of labor of single individuals adapted for the use of one worker. This meant production was scattered among many small individual producers. This scattering of production had its limits. It could not develop further as it did in capitalism. This happened because capitalism concentrated production. In the fourth section of Capital, Marx explained in detail how since the 15th century, this has been historically worked out through three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern history. But the bourgeoisie, as shown here, could not transform these puny means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them, at the same time, from means of production of the individual into social means of production only workable by a collectivity of men. Because now commodities were the product of social production, no one person could say they made it. This is the contradiction of capitalism. Wealth is generated by a collective of people but owned by an individual. This has given rise to all the social antagonisms of today. It has reduced the productive power of a single individual into an exchangeable part of capitalist production. So much for the capitalist claim of reaping benefits of their hard work. The need is to reorganize the social nature of modern productive forces, to recognize that the mode of production that is capitalism has determined the social relations. The solution is to have society directly take control of production and have it fit the desired social relations, not the other way around. Active social forces seem like that they impose themselves blindly and destructively only if we do not understand them. But once we understand, then we can subject them to our own will to achieve objectives. This understanding goes against capitalism and the bourgeoisie, which is why they fight like hell to make sure these ideas stay out of mainstream media and educational institutions. As capitalism develops, it turns more and more people into proletarians. These proletarians become an exploitive majority, who turn into a force for revolution. The revolution in turn takes the means of production and makes them the property of the state, eliminating the position of proletariat. The state has always been a representative of the elite in society. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens. In the Middle Ages, the feudal landlords. In our own times, the bourgeoisie. When there is no subjugated class or anarchy in production, meaning it is organized and not market-driven, the state is no longer necessary. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the agitators, and as to its ultimate scientific inefficiency, and also the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand. The document was written to show how socialism was developed from a utopian idea of society wanted to a true understanding of how societies worked, thus enabling us to understand how a socialist society can be created. The dialectic is a correct form of logic, but it has its limitations because it is not grounded in materialism. Historical materialism gave the world an understanding of why societies were the way they were. Marx combined historical materialism with the dialectic into dialectical materialism to create the communist philosophy. Dialectical materialism allows us to understand the material conditions of all societies and how those conditions work with and against each other. This was the genius of Karl Marx.